very quickly. And so what I'd like to open things off with today, and I believe folks will trickle in as we get the conversation underway, but I'm hoping that our panelists can begin by introducing themselves and to take Danny's suggestion, what your definition of media literacy is. So Alexis, would you like to begin? I'm just going to go in order of how you all appear on my screen.
Hi, sure. Hello, everyone. So my name is Alexis Romero Walker. I am an assistant professor at Manhattanville College, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. And I am also the teaching chair for AEJMC's Media Ethics Division. And I focus my research on media literacy in entertainment media, and in our kind of pop culture media classrooms. And for me, media literacy can follow the simple definition that we talk about, which is to evaluate, analyze, really figure out how to critique media, and then think about it too when we're creating media. But for me too, it's just an ability to see media and be in our world of media and think a little bit more about it, not just accept it without any kind of thought process to it, but really to engage with it and to make sure that when we create media, because we're all creators, that we are thinking about what messages we are sending to those that consume the media that we create. So that's me.
Great. Thanks, Alexis. Patrick, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hello. I'm Patrick Johnson. I am the head of the Graduate Commission, and I am the director of student media and an assistant professor of journalism at Marquette University, which is my alma mater. I'm also 2 weeks away from defending my dissertation. So that's, a chore in itself mentally at the moment. And when I think about media literacy, a lot of my research kind of takes two different directions. I definitely live in the media literacy and equity space, and I get to do a lot of really wonderful work with a team where we study the ideas of equity-based practices and how do we utilize media literacy to improve systems of oppression in particular. Which means I often study the ethics of media literacy and the ethics of media practice and what that means to actually interact with systems that dilute or diminish, especially those who were marginalized or minoritized. On the flip side, I also pay probably way more attention in my work to news literacy in particular, where I spend, and one of the questions that is listed for me is about my dissertation, which is I focus a lot about the practitioners who are media literate. In this case, for me, it's journalists and possibly their lack of media and or news literacy. And so when I utilize that term, I do it twofold. I think there's this media literacy as knowledge, in which it's, how do we understand both personal and social processes, whether it's the production element of media or the distribution element or how people consume, that wonderful media effects tradition, so to speak. And then I also see media literacy as a skill. And so thinking about how do we work within classrooms and media spaces to help users or whether it's youth or actual practitioners or everyday citizens, to have some control over the process of media. How do they actually create it, but how do they also navigate media production in ways that produce really thoughtful and effective skills?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Patrick. Alan, if you'd like to go next.
Thank you, Brianna. Hi, I'm Alan Goldenbach. I'm an associate professor of journalism at Hood College, which is a small liberal arts school about 40 miles north of DC and 40 miles west of Baltimore. This is my 9th year here, and it's a second career for me. I was a reporter for the Washington Post for 12 years, so I've seen both the practical and theoretical sides of things. And when I think of media literacy, Patrick, I liked your use of the word skill, because it absolutely is a skill, no matter the media environment that you're examining. But when I think of media literacy, I think of trying to understand the impact of the communication on not just the audience, but the audience's audience, and really what will be the result of you disseminating this message. That to me is what media literacy is about, in addition to what has already been said.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Danny, if you'd like to go next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Denny Elliott, and I just over the summer stepped down from my chair, the Poynter Jameson Chair of Media Ethics and Press Policy at the University of South Florida. Prior to that 20-year career, I taught in departments of philosophy and education at the University of Montana and Dartmouth, and ran ethics centers at both campus-wide ethics centers at both of those institutions. And now I'm professor emeritus and writing books for fun instead of academics. In terms of media literacy, as somebody who's thought a lot about teaching ethics, I always start with outcomes and assessment and kind of then fill in with activities. So when I think of media literacy, I think, well, what is it that I want students to do that maybe they haven't been able to do before that? And what I look for in media literacy is that they can identify ultimate sources for statements of purported fact, that they can identify at least one potential bias that that each of those sources may have, because life being what it is, except for maybe AI, I wouldn't call AI objective. So I don't think any of us are completely objective. And so I think identifying where the biases might be is an important part of media literacy. The ability to differentiate statements of fact from statements of opinion, for sure. And to differentiate between connotative and denotative language so that they can appreciate when bias is being implicitly induced just by language choice. And last of all, I would say the ability to identify what's missing. And that, so from looking at an initial story and digging around to see what other hopefully more credible sources might have to say about it, or at least different sources, they can identify information that's covered by, on one site from information that's not included on another site.
Great, thank you. And then Belina, if you'd like to round out our discussion on your views on the definition of media literacy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Belina Diabru, and I'm at Sacred Heart University, but I'm also the president of the International Council for Media Literacy, and I've been doing this work for about 28 years now, which is hard to believe. And I also was in broadcasting beforehand, so I also have a practical experience in this area before going into the academic realm. I would say that I love all the pieces of the definition that everyone's contributed here, and I think we could take all of that and just make it into one big one. For me, I am looking for people to be thoughtful about the information that they partake in. I think that, we spend a lot of time in the media literacy world, in part, trying to tell people where to go with information. And I think that's a problem, especially because people are very divided right now and very polarized. And so my goal is really not to take people in that direction as much as to help them to think more about how they are receiving information, how they're processing it, so that they can see that there are multiple points of view and that there are perspectives and that we all need perspective. Certainly in this day and age with all the things that are happening, not just in the United States, but around the world, the way in which we see things, we need that ability more than ever. And I worry sometimes that media literacy has been minimized in its role in the way that it's being presented to people in schools. In fact, I get very uncomfortable with some of the ideas and curriculums that are sort of being thrown into the K through 12 space, because I feel like it's a very limited view of what media literacy is. And it's actually one of the reasons why I appreciate the work that the news literacy groups are doing, but I also feel like it's kind of limited the stretch for which we're trying to take people in their thinking, in the idea of grasping that there is a globalized look at the world, and that it's bigger than the simplified definitions.
Very well said. Well, thank you everyone for sharing, kind of speaking about simplified definitions, very quick snippets on what are probably very global and broad views on what is media literacy and what encompasses media literacy. Very briefly, for folks who may have joined in while the introductions were ongoing, my name is Brianna Trefiro. I am the teaching chair for the Graduate Education Commission of AEJMC. For those of you who feel comfortable, feel free to drop in the chat maybe where you're based or your institution. If you're a grad student, what stage you are in your education. If you're a professor, that as well, just so we can all get to know each other a bit more. And while we are doing that, I'm going to open up with our first actual question, which is a little tangentially related to our opening question of what and how do you define media literacy. And this is broad for anyone who wants to take it, but when we talk about media ethics, why does media literacy also need to be a part of that conversation? So why are those two things kind of interchangeable, if not codependent on one another, in your views?
I'll go. To me, the reason that they are symbiotic, so to speak, is that I think one of the most ethical forms of media practice and production is a literate practice and production. On the flip side, I think it's also, when you're in the media literacy space, acknowledging that not everyone is doing what they can for your best interest. And in many respects, I do think that's where we in the news literacy space have limited the definition of media literacy, in that we aren't actually really giving cannon fodder to the idea that not everybody is a good actor, and not everybody has pro-social purposes, and not everybody has an agenda that is meant to promote ethical discourse. That there are a lot of people, places, things, ideas, professions that their purpose is to do more than persuade, that their purpose is to misinform, that their purpose is to propagate. And because of that, I think the media ethics space and the media literacy space really could afford to learn a whole lot from each other, and really play with one another, so to speak, in the same sandbox. I think it's one of the most important pieces to my teaching of media ethics. I teach media ethics from a framework of media literacy, not just media ethics from a framework of normative values or meta-philosophical practices. And so I think to train students to be media literate also means them to train them to be understanding of ethical practice and process.
Following up on Patrick, and I think that was wonderful. And Patrick, I think that what you started us off with is the fact that we're not consumers, we're all producers. And so that idea that ethics is some professional thing that, people get in journalism school and then no one else has to worry about it. Those days are long over. And so the idea of perceiving oneself as a producer as well as a skeptical consumer, I think is a wonderful start and embeds literacy in ethics.
I'm going to add on to that and say, I think it's the lack of ethics that have gotten us to where we are right now. It's the fact that we haven't even thought about that as a part of the process when it comes to the media that has added to the detriment of the cycle of the unknown, the questions, the misinformation, the rabbit holes that people go into. And I think it's unfortunate that we haven't thought about the ethical components as being symbiotic, as Patrick was saying, because it is, absolutely is. And I think it's more important every day that we realize that we need that ethical component, especially with this generative AI in place and the things that are to come. We tend to run into walls right now with information, and I feel like we're literally banging heads against each other because we're not seeing the ethical components of issues, how it affects people, the fact that ethics and even to say morality are all a part of the conversation, that we just tend to not step into it. And one of the reasons why I feel that it's concerning more is because I think people are afraid to go down this road, because it puts a spotlight on issues, and it puts a spotlight in a more interpersonal way that people aren't always registering. We tend to use the media sometimes without consciousness. And so this is actually an awareness piece in bringing forth that conscious space that makes you reflective of all the ways in which you use media tools.
Great.
I'll just jump in with one thing that I wanted to add. We framed a lot of this in the context of news, which I journalists through and through, I certainly see that. But I want to expand this to all forms of mass communication, where we consider any effort to communicate involves some sort of social contract, where there is a promise and an expectation, and is that expectation being met? And whatever the purpose is of that communication, does the person who is delivering it fulfill that promise? And if not, then there is, or if they fail on it, is it simply just a creative error, or is there some more of a moral error and a moral failing on the part of the communicator there? So we can think about this from the entertainment perspective, as well as from the journalistic or the advertising perspective, marketing perspective, all of these, where there's that understanding that I'm going to deliver something to you, and if it doesn't, then I have failed.
Yeah, Ellen, I think you bring up a very interesting point, that we often talk about media literacy in the context of news and journalism. But we also, I see somebody in the chat says they study video literacy. There are a lot of ways in which we need to be media literate individuals. So I think that's a great way to highlight marketing and advertising as well. Denny, did you unmute yourself? Did you want to add something? No.
Oh, just adding into Alan that helping students distinguish what kind of media they're consuming is itself, I think, I know an initial step in media literacy, that I mean, just even differentiating between social media and what I call legacy media.
Definitely. Absolutely. I completely agree. We're going to segue a little bit to discuss the pedagogy behind media literacy just a bit. So this question is specifically for Belina. But we know that you specialize in global media literacy and educating educators, right? And that's a big part of how we came to decide on what the topic for this panel should be, right? How do we educate the educators? So how do we teach future educators or even current educators on how to use media literacy practices and principles for when they must navigate difficult conversations in the classroom?
So there's so many things about this question that I kind of, my brain goes into different areas, because I think that you need to recognize who you are as the person in this media world first, right? You need to see what you're using as tools, how you practice it, how you behave intentionally and unintentionally with media, so that you can understand the kinds of spaces that you're in. And also that you also recognize that media is about entertainment too. It's the me in media. That was something that David Considine, who was a media theorist from several years ago, would say, because you can't go into this without recognizing that each person is influenced by different things, and their choices are their own. And so often I say to educators, you don't enter this realm without being respectful of the fact that there are different media choices, and those choices may not be your own. And because of that, you also need to learn how to be good listeners and not to be the people who are always jumping in with an answer, because sometimes there is no answer. Sometimes it's about this. Actually, I will say this. I think in order for media literacy to work in classes, you need to create an ability to be able to allow for students to tell you what their choices are, and for them to feel that their choices are respected despite your own biases. And I think that means that you have to set yourself aside sometimes, which is really a difficult thing to process when you're early on, because you're learning to be an educator, you're stepping in front of a classroom, you're trying to sort of manage all these other things. And there's this tendency to say, well, that's right and that's wrong. And that's really not the media literacy space. The media literacy space is so that you can endeavor to open those conversations, so that you can have discourse that puts you in those difficult spaces, so that you can understand why someone believes what they believe and a point of view that they have, and to foster that critical discourse, that dialogue that is incredibly important, so that we can move forward, not just within the classroom, but outside of the classroom as well.
Wonderful point. Thank you. I agree. Wonderfully said. Kind of along that same vein, I want to spend a bit of time here talking about inside the classroom and our role as educators. So for those who teach journalism specifically, Alexis had a really poignant question that I'm gonna steal and pitch to the group, but specifically thinking about large global events, and the one she highlighted, which I think is especially poignant, is the conflict between Israel and Palestine right now. But even, you know, outside of that, in the last 5 years, the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, where misinformation spreads very rapidly and like wildfire. Journalists often don't have access to those areas and are reliant on information coming out of those areas. So how can we, for the first prong of this question is, what sort of media literacy practices do we think about when we're combining journalism and ethics with that lens of misinformation and the misinformation age? So I'll offer that as one prong of the question. And Denny, I can see you've already unmuted, so I'm going to throw to you first. But if folks want to ruminate on the second part of the question while Denny's speaking, the second part of the question is, how can we as media consumers, but also educators, use media literacy when thinking about ethics on reporting on really tragic events and tragic forms of information? So Denny, if you'd like to start us off.
Yes, just to say that Belina, I think, gave us the answer to the first question in saying that sometimes there is no answer. That an important distinction between journalistic truth and scientific truth is that journalistic truth is evolving. That we need to get the story right as it is, knowing that it's going to change tomorrow, and helping students appreciate the difference between scientific truth, which is generalizable, reproducible, you know, that's something different. And that with journalism, we may never get the whole story because it is something that's evolving. And Belina, I think, also said something really important about our students feeling safe to take intellectual risk and personal risk in our classrooms. That the first day of every ethics class for a very long time, I've helped people understand that this class is going to make you feel really uncomfortable. And it's about you learning to listen and learning how to process other people's perspectives, even when they really are violently different from your own. And that if we can do this in our classroom, then you can take it forward and do it in community.
Wonderful. Thanks, Denny. Belina?
I was just going to say, I always say it's being uncomfortable in the uncomfortable, right? And also being uncomfortable in the unknown. I also think sometimes we need to take a pause just because something is happening in the world right now does not mean that we need to rush to have that major conversation. I often find it troubling that people expect an answer right away when there's a lot that needs to be processed and there's a lot that is unfolding simultaneously. And I think this is actually where journalists get a little bit into trouble here, because they are trying to report at the moment, at that second. And I've spent a lot of time reading comments from people who are saying, well, why didn't you ask that question? Why didn't you say that? Why didn't you think that? And I'm like, well, at that second, at that moment, that might not have been the right opportunity or the right second to do that. I think that has to be applicable in our classrooms as well, that sometimes the conversations are greater and deeper. I think there is a lot to be said about historical context, which is being missed. Misinformation, which is beyond the way we see information in the world. I'm just saying that this is it's bigger than the reporting of this story versus that story. It's also because people have included personal history along with historic history, and that has added a different type of context to the messaging that we receive. And in an ethics class or in a media literacy class, it's important to hear that, because then you understand why people say what they say, why they believe what they say, and also it helps for other people to recognize that difference. And I think recognizing that is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to deflect the question, I promise. But one of the things that I've always said is one of my greatest blessings is that I wasn't just trained as a journalist, I was trained as a teacher as well as a journalist. That my degrees are all in education and in journalism. And I will consistently argue that next to teachers, journalists are the next best educators. And so I think what this question brings to light for me is something that I think we always need to continue to argue for. And that's, this is one of the most opportune places for us to have a lot of really good conversations and crossover with schools and colleges of education. And really bringing them and those pre-service teachers into conversation with our pre-service journalists, our pre-service public relations professionals, because ethics and literacy are the core function of both practices. To be a good teacher means to be an ethically, morally responsible one that is highly literate. Colleges of education, schools of ed, teachers all take a literacy across content areas course. We value numerical literacy. We value visual literacy. And my argument is, this is where we can really bring in those schools into our departments to say, let's now value media literacy, so that not only are we training journalists and public relations professionals and advertising professionals, digital media professionals to, one, take a pause. I agree with that. I think there's something to be said about that critical moment of breathing that we've kind of lost, even arguably since like the 24-hour news cycle and the downfall of the fairness doctrine. But I think what we need to do is, in an ethics course, we need to train our journalists to be more literate, meaning how do we actually get them to stop, take that pause, and then actually process what is a historical argument? What is a personal argument? Where are the lines when it means to go somewhere and not go somewhere? When we're talking about a conflict or a war like Israel and Hamas at this very moment, how do we get these moments for conversation to occur? Well, that's actually not just our problem. It is clearly a problem quite consistently across our populations. And I think, again, that's a moment of, we can do something in the journalism space or the media professional space. But I think this is a true moment of us to have a collaborative process between education and media, where we really can build a more possible and plausible infrastructure that's rooted in literacy and ethics.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Alexis, do you want to take a stab at that?
I was just going to add a little thing. What I've been trying to do when it's like hard to ease into these kinds of conversations is to really focus on the part of media literacy of how all media are constructed, and working with students to think about that in relation to emotion, because we are being thrown all of this information to have an emotional response, because having an emotional response is how we get you to believe something, because you start to feel connected to it, because it makes you feel, and you don't always know how to navigate those emotions. So working with students to say, okay, here's a story or here's a social media post, and it wants you to click on it and then share it to your Instagram. And how is it emotionally engaging you to get you to do that? And let's take a little bit more, let's break down that so we can see if this is actually information that, needs to be shared, if it is misinformation or not. And even if it is correct, like, or information, quote unquote, is it helpful? Is it doing something more than, just grasping on emotion? And sometimes grasping on emotion is important. I'm not saying that it isn't, but it is influencing your decisions and like how you decide what this information means. So that's been helpful for me when working with students, because you are talking about something difficult, but you're kind of being given a task along the way, to open up that conversation. And additionally, it hopefully promotes what Lena was saying, which is slow down. Take a second. Like, this takes time to go through this process, and that can also be exhausting. So like, decide when you can do that, and when you can't, maybe this isn't the best time to like go all in sharing things and stuff. So that's kind of one thing that I've been trying to do with my students that I think has been successful.
Definitely. And I like how there's kind of been this thread, a common thread of what most of you are saying regarding emotion and writing and conveying emotion, as well as kind of what you mentioned, Alexis. Often they want engagement and shares and posts on your Instagram story, and what's flashy is going to get a lot of shares, right? So I think having a really critical eye is very important, especially in what Patrick was saying, the 24-hour media cycle, right? Everything is just trying to grab your attention. So I think that is an incredibly useful skill that often can be overlooked, especially in the classroom. So I think that everyone touched on really, really salient and important points there. To that end, I kind of want to pivot a bit to talk about the role of journalists. So I'm sure, Alan, I'd love to hear you chime in. This question is specifically for Patrick, because as you kind of previewed your dissertation work for us a little bit at the start, but your dissertation work specifically focuses on how to train the next generation of media literate journalists. What led you to focus your research in this area? And can you tell us a little bit about your approach for your research?
Yeah, so a lot of this came from me being a high school teacher for almost a decade and watching as my students became increasingly less literate of media practices. And they would start following people in accounts that they would define as a trustworthy journalist or media professional. And these are students I'm working with that are considered some of the best in the country in terms of their media production. And when I left, I knew news literacy was going to be an area I wanted to focus on. But the question I ended up asking was, if we constantly are saying to be news literate means to be and act like a journalist, that very like news appreciation model out of Stony Brook, no one's actually ever asked if journalists themselves are actually news literate. And we think that like what we're watching on the broadcast news, or what's coming across on our social feeds, or what we're reading as a headline or a story in reputable and both national and local media, we're just making this assumption that we have trained these people to be news and media literate. And therefore, we're assuming that a consumer should mimic or model, almost like a ventriloquism, so to speak, based on what these folks are doing. And so it led me to ask the question, actually, are they news literate? And they're not, unfortunately. I mean, research that's out there says that consumers worldwide are about 50% news literate, if you average all those out. Well, journalists themselves are on the same scale are only about 75 to 78% news literate, with conservative journalists ranking below 50%. And to me, that says that we have to do something different. And to me, a framework of news literacy means to be ethical. It means to be responsible. And so what my dissertation does is outline a new model of journalism, so to speak, that operates under this idea that news literacy must be the forefront and education must be the bedrock of which we do journalism. And so I developed and found a couple behaviors and values that would be embodied within this practice, this model, from almost 250 surveys with journalists and 32-hour plus interviews with journalists. And what's super cool for me is that because I come from education, there's a whole set of appendices in my dissertation that is a curriculum of how journalism schools can actually take and implement this model and reproduce it. And so there's even lesson plans, there's syllabi, there's scope structuring for 4 years of how to reframe our journalism schools to impart more news literate behaviors and values that hopefully can create a more educational, ethical, and responsible journalist in the long run. And so that's where it got me. We'll see if people actually believe it. But yeah.
I'll take your lead, Brian, and jump in on this. I'm going to disavow all confirmation bias claims here, but Patrick, thank you very much for giving me all of that, because that backs up a lot of what I saw as a working journalist, and during the first decade of the century. And it wasn't simply my colleagues, it was peers, it was friends, it was people all throughout journalism I was noticing. And I would love to talk with you a little bit more about your research, Patrick, actually, but I would love to know, I was always wondering, is this a lack of the skill that had it always been there, or was it the evolving technology that was shaping this? But one of the things that really led me towards a career in academia was this, as the world became digital and our communication basically became social, I was shocked at almost the naivete, gullibility, what have you, of people who were trained to ferret out the best information possible and disseminate it to the largest audience possible. That is what journalists are trained to do. And they were failing on the first part of it. They were not getting the best information, or when they were supposed to be filtering out bad information, some of it was getting through. And when you ask what are journalists trained to do, they're trained to gather information and disseminate it as widely as possible. There's nothing in that job description says, well, is there something about being prudent about the information that you're getting? I remember a conversation, a meeting I was at one of the times when I said, I gotta leave, was when I asked, the question was, do we want to be first or do we want to be the best? And I was told both. And I said, you can't do that. You can't necessarily do that all the time. But when you have, and so I'm sure I'll get a chance to get to this later, but this is where the financial element of communication gets into play, where the bottom line often dictates your content. And if market forces are kind of dictating, well, this is the bar that we're setting for the quality of the content that we're distributing or that we're gathering, then that's gonna dictate above above any other measure of quality. It's about, can we, where does this fall in affecting our bottom line? So in terms of journalists being trained for media literacy, I think we need to certainly evaluate that.
Well, and to me, what's super interesting about what you said is that's not uncommon. I mean, I spoke to journalists who were from boomers down to Gen Z, and consistently the argument is that people think we're a whole lot more literate than we really are. It's this like you said, you opened a confirmation bias. So they therefore bought into this idea that because I am the godlike beacon of news. Everyone must trust and believe in me. And I mean, and if you look at these crises of news that we're having, whether it's the loss of trust or political issues, financial issues, misinformation, news avoidance, what essentially I learned is that we need to be training journalists or media professionals broadly to assess credibility beyond just fact checking, that this idea of being prudential in that regard, that they need to stay current, not just of the news themselves, but also of their practices. One of the things that a lot of them said is they haven't learned since journalism school, and everything they learned in journalism school is no longer applicable to their careers. But then they also need to learn how to be literate of the relationships that they build and understanding the audiences that they serve. These very like solutions journalism, engagement journalism, solidarity journalism kind of practices of care. And to be literate in this practice, or at least the values I would argue we should teach if we want more news literate journalists or more media literate media professionals, are ideas of service and engagement and transparency. But the crux of my argument is that we need to teach our professionals to be more metacognitive. They can tell you how to change an f-stop on a camera. They can tell you how to edit an image in Photoshop. They can tell you how to write a press release, you name it. We train them to know and to be skilled in something, but we don't train them to be metacognitive of the process, to explain it, to be able to conscientiously be pro-literate, so to speak, in which they need to be able to work with their audiences and their communities, especially in our marginalized and minoritized communities who are lacking so many more resources than, and they're substantially more distrustful of media broadly. We need our media professionals to become educators who are actually willing to explain what they do to help us, help them, and help their communities. And so, but I don't know how we get there. I mean, that's a large shift culturally.
I just wanted to jump in a little bit on this, only because I think one of the other things is that we also need to meet our audience where they're at. And I think often we're still thinking about journalism in its traditional form, and it's so non-traditional in the way our youth are looking at it, correct? I mean, that's just the reality of where they're at. But I also think, you know, when I all the things that you all have said are so important and so real at this point. The issue also is that we have opinion journalists, not journalists. And that's really taken over the cycle. And so we can't, so the average person doesn't differentiate between that. And when I think of journalists, certainly, and I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but the reality is we used to look to the journalists as that person. They were part of our family. They were in the middle of our living room. We went to them, the Walter Cronkites, the Peter Jennings, like we could talk about the ones that we really highly valued, because we didn't see them as opinion makers. And now with the 24-hour news cycle, which Patrick mentioned, it has really, it's kind of a blasphemy, to be honest, to call it news, and I find that that's really part of the problem, is that it's made it so it's so difficult for people to actually understand what bias is, what information is, and how to break it down. And to go to the next step, which is to seek more, find out more, especially because what you're being given is so peripheral to the foundation of an issue. And I think that actually has to be an added value that we need to think about. I'm also going to just also note that one of the things that I find troubling a lot in journalism schools is that we're teaching about marketing of journalism, not journalism. And I think that has been a huge disservice to this industry, to this. I used to think of it as when we talked about the fourth estate, it had a purpose and a voice and a reason for why it was so necessary. But if it's confiscated with all these other things, we've kind of lost some of that. And so it's not revered in the way that it used to be. It's very much a business model.
Definitely. We could definitely have a whole panel about the commercialization of journalism too, and the capitalist nature of the beast that is the 24-hour news cycle. So I love that everyone's touched on that so far. Other thoughts before we move on? I think this is definitely a fruitful area. Alan, I do want to circle back to you because we've spent a lot of time on news specifically and news and journalism, and I'd like to talk a bit about your work in sports and sports media as well, and entertainment media, just to give that a little bit of airtime. So I'm wondering if you could talk about teaching students on reporting on entertainment and sports, if you cover that all in your coursework or in your curricula, and why, in your opinion, is it equally important to know about media literacy in those realms as well?
Well, I keep telling, I always say, Mark Felt, who was Deep Throat in Watergate thing, is to me the greatest journalism professor of all time, because he gave us the three most important words: follow the money. And in terms of understanding why a piece of content is being disseminated, where is the financial impact on it, to the sender, to the audience, to the subjects of the content? That is, I mean, my students almost like, it's almost become, my students have parodied me over the years now, because I keep on referring to that so often. Where if we are not teaching the business models and how money is being made off of media, particularly critical for our students these days, because they do not pay for any content. Maybe they pay for a Netflix or an Apple Music subscription, but that's it. They are used to getting content for free. Well, what's the impact of that? What is the impact that do they realize that because they're getting free content, it's probably of lesser quality? Is it, if they don't see anything for comparison's sake, then how do they know that's lesser quality? Do they understand why maybe this content that they have here is of lesser quality? Do they realize it was just it was just aggregated, it wasn't actually reported? How, if they don't understand the business models of media today, we're doing them a huge disservice. So when it comes to entertainment media, sports media, understanding why we are giving them so much attention, there is a financial windfall in it for the subjects here. The more we get word out about particular sports organizations, particular entertainment franchises, that's, some people look at it as journalism. I say it's advertising, because we are doing their advertising. So if we can actually help students understand the market forces around media, I think we're doing a really big job here of helping them understand a little bit more about their media literacy skills that are necessary.
Perfect. Alexis?
Yeah, can I add a little bit? So I teach pop culture classes, which is always really fun.
Yeah.
And so I emphasize that, these are still important things for us to think about through a lens of media literacy as well. And just because it's pop culture, just because it's entertainment or sports, doesn't mean that it's not news. It is, as was said, like trying to gain your attention for a reason. But there are still, I think, really important conversations that have been in these spaces. I think about sport particularly right now being used for anti-trans rhetoric, and the way that it targets particular audiences by connecting it to a certain realm of entertainment or sports, and etc. And so it is so important that sorry, my dog knows it's dinner time. It is so important that we take it seriously, because it's still sharing critical messages and ideologies in it. So I just want to emphasize that, I do think that sometimes we focus a lot on news media because we think, oh, this is the actual one that impacts our life. But I do think that sports and entertainment impact our lives tremendously, because it's usually where we go to turn off. And if we are turning off and not realizing that those messages are still being sent, well, that that's a problem. So yeah, that's my addition.
I'm actually in the process of putting together a course for next semester. It's in our honors program on sports washing, which, if you're not familiar with the term, basically it's how, dictatorships or any kind of heavy-handed regimes will use sports to basically cover up any kind of social ills. And if that's not, a perfect example of how we can really overlook some really key social and political issues in this world, just because we are, entertained by whatever we're seeing, then journalists are really failing on that job there.
That sounds like a fascinating course too. That's one I would snap up quick as an undergrad or a grad student. Patrick, I'm just clicking into what you said. Great book about pop culture and politics relative to what is news, called Pop Culture, Politics in the News, Entertainment Journalism in the Polarized Media Landscape by Joel Penny. Perfect. Thanks, Patrick. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip around a little bit in our list of questions. If folks in the group would have any questions for our panelists, you can either raise your hand, or if you feel more comfortable, dropping in the chat, and I'll read them to the group. And while that's happening, or in lieu of questions from the audience, I'm going to ask everyone if we could go around and just share how you work with your students to not only use media literacy when analyzing media, but also now increasingly important is creating media and creating content in their own, social lives or social presences. It's easier to use media literacy in critique, or saying that something is not media literate or someone is not media literate. But it's harder to implement that in practice, right? So what ways do we make sure that students are able to implement media literate tools in their lives? And anyone can take that in any order.
I can start. And I think for me, when I approach teaching, and especially since I teach ethics quite often, and in particular to the topic of this particular panel, it's that piece of metacognition. It's actually forcing them to turn those media literacy questions on themselves. And in doing so, explain the process of what they did. They are, I don't know if I'm the only one having this problem, but they're very self-conscious at all times, to the point where they are even being unwilling to be like critical of one another's work because they're afraid it's going to do something to them, that I was critical of this person, therefore they're going to like attack me back. And so I've spent a lot more time in much more Zen places, I feel like, with them, where we do a lot more with silence, and we do a lot more with self-reflection, and it probably helps that I was trained over most of my life in Jesuit Catholic institutions. But this idea that it's okay to be constructively critical. And sometimes that starts with personal, quiet introspection. And I do think, and it's been something that's been consistent through what we've all said, is that we have to get students to stop going so quickly and to start being uncomfortable. And the place that they're most uncomfortable quite often is in silence and in criticism. And so really training them to be more comfortable with those uncomfortable practices, being okay to have an instructor in front of the room who will just sit there and wait for people to generate thoughts instead of even ourselves. We like to fill spaces. Educators are the worst. We are like, oh, like we joke about the quote unquote pregnant pause. Like, we don't do that. We're like, wait, no one answered the question in 30 seconds. Like, I got to move on. And I think that's something that we need to be literate of too. But I think training this idea of constructive silence, which in turn can help make constructive dialogue, I think are two incredibly important pieces, at least in my classrooms, to promoting students' capacity to be more literate of the work that they're doing, and not just literate of the work that their colleagues are doing or the professionals are doing. And I also think I tend to frame everything in terms of pre-service, giving them the opportunity to fail. You are not, quote unquote, the true to form professional just yet. Yes, can they create things on their own all the time? Sure. And drives me nuts. And people call journalism content production. I can't do it. I can't do it. Because we're storytellers. But I think giving them the opportunity to say that there is a line between being a professional and being a quote unquote content creator. And sometimes that's that capacity to slow down and be critical of one's own work and be willing to fail. Because that will produce a more ethical journalist or a more ethical advertiser or a more ethical professional, public relations professional.
Denny, would you like to go next?
Sure. And I will actually weave in some of what I was thinking about in terms of the question that was sent ahead of time. That's in terms of marginalized folks and how we address that within media literacy. And I think this actually works off well from Patrick's points and the talk of representation in entertainment, for example, in pop culture. That goes way beyond news, but is part of, I'd say, just as we want students to notice what is missing in terms of a purported story, we need to know who's missing as well. And within the disabled community, we have a mantra, nothing about us without us. And that works for all marginalized people. I think that, the bias that is easiest to overlook is one when we all share the same basic assumptions. And so if we can help students in terms of their self-reflection, as Patrick says, as well as in noticing media, who's missing and how are different kinds of people being represented. I think that that we bring in the diversity, equity, inclusion aspect that is essential to ethics, just as media literacy is essential to ethics. We bring that all together. And a technique that I use for this in teaching may sound a little odd, but I do a lot of work on web accessibility and particularly people with visual impairment. And so I research and write about the production of alt text and audio description. And it's, I think that one of the ways to help students become visually literate, among other things, is to ask them how they would write alt text, or what's called, an alternative text, how they would describe in words what's in this photo within the context. And that's what's in the photo within the context. Both are essential. Some of the recent work I've been doing has to do with looking at institutions of higher education and their websites and how awful, when it even exists, how awful the alt text is. If you're visually taking something in, you see 5 students standing around a table in a chem lab, all, engrossed in what's going on. Well, if you're looking at it, you also notice that there are people of different skin colors and people that are not gender specific, and probably nobody who is obviously disabled, but that's another issue. But what we put into description often ignores implicit messages that are being given. And so I think that teaching media literacy can't be done without teaching visual literacy, without teaching universal design and how it is that we let everybody in the door.
Great, thank you. If folks have other thoughts, or we can also sprinkle in Sarah Lynn's question for the group, were there any success stories or impactful moments from your experiences teaching media literacy that folks would feel comfortable sharing as well?
So I'm
Alina?
just gonna just mention last semester I had one of the best classes in media literacy I've ever had. And they all know that I love them, so they won't be surprised to hear this. But I think what made it really vibrant and amazing was because they let me in as much as I let them in. And I say that because teaching media literacy comes with risk. And anybody who doesn't know that today needs to be aware of that, especially because it's being discussed in a way that isn't media literacy at all, actually. But, that's the way it goes, right? We're in these interesting spaces. What I learned from them, and this actually relates to something Patrick said earlier, is that their voice is super important, but they're not certain that their voice has a place. And in fact, I would say that they think that they're a little bit more cautionary about using their voice because they don't know how it will be manipulated in the media and their mediated world, because of cell phones, and because of just different things, and they have a lot of questions. In fact, they started raising their hand and asking for adulting moments. And I found that to be really precious in a way, because there's a lot of assumptions about generations, which have been sort of repeated over and over again by the media. And it's usually very negative towards whether it's Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen X, whatever the next thing is going to be of the boomer generation. And it's so problematic because what it does is that it minimizes these groups as individuals. And there are questions that they have, not just about themselves, but about each other. And there's assumptions that they question, and then they're wronged in many ways through the media because of the way in which they are manufactured by the media, in whichever way that it's being presented. So for me, I think what I found most brave about them is how much they were willing to step into the limelight, to ask a question that put them in a vulnerable space, and to allow it to exist within the 30 of us in the room. And so for me, though, that highlights an impactful media literate moment, because it wasn't about you're right, you're wrong. It's about, I have a question and I want an answer, and it's not to offend anybody or to bring controversy. It's literally because I just have a question and I'd like an answer, or at least the best answer that you can give me at that moment. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know. And I think we have to be comfortable as educators to be in that I don't know space, which is also a very uncomfortable space, I think, for educators to be in, because we're expected to be these, stage on the stage, or whatever you want to call it. We're human. And there's a lot that I think that we're all learning together about each other and going forward.
And I'll add a little bit there because I have a more practical example that can both add to this question and also to Sarah Lynn. Hi, Sarah Lynn. Sarah Lynn's question, which is, anybody who's been to one of my presentation knows that I talk about lighting and visual representation and teaching future practitioners how to do lighting equitably. And I think I went to film school, so that's my background. And I just think of how much I didn't learn in film school in terms of actually equitably representing people on screen. Didn't learn anything at all. And so when I teach media production classes, they're usually intro classes for, the one that every student has to take so they know a little bit. I try to emphasize that like there are these rules and there are these norms, but like who have these rules and norms benefited, or who were those for and then were not adjusted when more people got to be included. And so we do a whole exercise on how 3-point lighting is really only made for people with lighter skin, and it doesn't really work for people with darker skin tones. And to what you were just saying, as an educator, I have to talk to them about how I don't know the best way to do this necessarily, because I was not taught the best way to do this. And so now this is a collaborative experience where we're going to practice and see what works the best for this particular person, with, of course, permission of the person or compensation for the person who is being who we're doing the lighting on. But we go through that process of like, we don't necessarily know, but it's important that we figure out and that we try things to make it better, because there is, as we've talked about historical perspectives, a history of specifically Black men, Black women being showcased very poorly with lighting in order to present an ideological message. And so we don't want to reinforce that as journalists have in the past with the visual images that they've shown, and that filmmakers have in the past with the images that they've shown. And adding that to Sarah Lynn's question, I got to do this, and I had students come up to me that just said like they had never thought about that, or they had never felt like their identities had been wrapped into the curriculum like this before. And it was really important to them to have that acknowledgement of their identity in a very simple lesson that wasn't about diversity. It was about the practice. And then that practice included conversations about diversity. I think without media literacy and being thoughtful about the production I was making there, I wouldn't have been able to really engage with that in the way that I have, and that the way I've helped students. So that, I think that's how I try to think about, especially production, like who is, as everyone has said, who is being included, who isn't being included, and how were those people included in the creation of the rules that we follow.
Just want to pick I love what you said there, Alexis. I want to piggyback though off of something that you added to, Belina, about getting students to ask questions, just feel comfortable about it. When I left journalism and went into academia, my approach to creating a media literacy course focused around one word, and still does today. It's called skepticism. And it's a skill that I think, and a mindset that in our instant gratification media world that we are in today, we don't practice nearly enough. And if you want examples of when teaching media literacy, I really feel like it's a success, it's starting somewhere around the midway point of the semester and afterwards, when students are starting to be skeptical of something that I may say. Sometimes I do it on purpose. Sometimes I, hey, have you thought about it from this perspective? No. Good. Please tell me about it. What about it? It's that kind of mindset of, well, what else is there? We're so quick to, because of how easily we are able to access information today, we think, great, that's it, I'm good, let's move on to the next piece of content that I can get. But rather than let it sit and let's think about it for a bit. When I see students getting to that point, that's when I feel like, we've done something as a media literacy community, getting people to be, maybe ease up on the gas pedal and be a little skeptical.
I love that. I love all of it. Thank you all so much for your thoughts and just really ruminating in what can be tricky and uncomfortable and delicate. And I think everyone shared their experiences and also suggestions on how instructors can learn from your experiences, but also tailor their own coursework. Does anyone have anything additional they'd like to add? I see Patrick has added some resources in the chat for folks who are interested, but anything that anyone else would like to add? Okay. If not, I'll just do a final plug for the Graduate Education Commission. Patrick and I are on the current leadership team, and I know we have a lot of grad students in the group with us today. So if you are interested, please feel free to send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat and we can talk more about anything from the Grad Education Commission to AEJMC, to media literacy and pedagogy. And then Alexis, if you'd like to do a plug for media ethics really quickly.
Yeah, come to media ethics stuff. Come see us at AJ, and join our newsletter. That's where you'll hear about things like this. So definitely feel free to look us up and get on there, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions as well.
Yeah, Patrick.
Also, Ethics has a book that is coming out on December 15th that is specifically about teaching media ethics and how, since ethics is taught so consistently, but usually by someone who doesn't have an ethics background. And so there's about 15 of us that put together a 16 chapter book. And it will be out on the 15th by Rowan and Littlefield. I highly encourage anybody to buy it, or get your libraries to buy it. It was fun to write for. So
Awesome. Anyone else? Anything else to add? Danny?
Yeah, I just would like to put in a plug for APPE, the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics. Actually, we often have had Media Ethics Division of AEJMC holding a meeting there as well in years past. But this year it's the long weekend of February 21st to the 25th in Cincinnati, Ohio. And one of our pre-conference workshops on that Thursday is a pedagogy workshop, and I would love for all of you to be there. I think you're just terrific teachers, and it's a nice opportunity for people who teach ethics to get together and talk about what's important. And Patrick, I look forward to your book.
Belina, do you want to tell us about the Azores really quickly? Sounds fun.
Just very quickly, I am hosting the 5th International Media Literacy Research Symposium in the Azores. So for those of you who don't know, it's an archipelago in the ocean, not 2 hours away from Portugal. I have to be honest and tell you, we've gotten an enormous amount of interest. The number of presentations that have come in, we're in the middle of the review process, have been amazing. In fact, the difficulty is how do we do space-wise? We're trying to figure out, like, could we put everybody together? But certainly, if you're interested in media literacy and you're interested in a global point of view, there will be people from all over the world. We have had submissions from China, Hong Kong, India, Europe, Africa. It has been the United States. It's been amazing to see the people who have submitted, and we do cover an ethics component within the actual symposium as well. So the registration opens in January, and we will have information around that time.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. If folks have questions, again, my email's in the chat. But if not, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope everyone enjoys hopefully a very productive and calm end to the semester. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Be well.
Bye.